Welcome to the 53rd episode of the First Person Podcast. We are continuing our conversation from February by discussing video game preservation and the industry. So if you haven't seen that one, please do check it out. We once again have special guest Alex Fleck to talk about why video game preservation matters in academia as well as its implications on gamer culture. Fresh from the game room, right to the study hall, please welcome our first-person scholars. Can everyone please introduce themselves and tell us what you've been playing recently?
Hey there, everyone. My name's Colin. I'm an assistant editor for the commentary section of FPS. You can find me online at CW Glassworks on Instagram. Lately, I cannot tell a word of a lie. I have been obsessed with Elden Ring, like I know a lot of us probably are. Always been a big FromSoft fan, and I'm very much enjoying their latest entry.
Hi, I'm Alex. Thanks for having me back again. My intro gets better and better, I think, because I think about all the things I missed last time. So I'm a researcher at the Games Institute in Waterloo, and a PhD candidate in English. I study, among other things, video game preservation. So I'm glad to be here to talk about it. I've been playing more Halo. It continues, even though the sort of population on the servers is dying down, apparently. And I've been playing Demon Souls because I want to do the reverse Elden Ring. I want to play Demon Souls, then Elden Ring, with nothing in between, and see how I feel about the design as that goes. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm Patrick. I am the co-EIC here at FPS, and I have been bouncing around between three main games. The one I've been playing the longest is Persona 5 Strikers, which is super fun. I love that Musa game, kind of like fighting, but like I don't like the Musa games so much. So this has been good with recognizable characters and kind of problematic, iffy plot. I've also been playing Dirt 5, which is like an arcade racer. Again, I love, this is going to be a trend. I love like the gameplay of like sims, like rally sims, but I'm too bad at them. So I need like the sort of helps and the like, stuff like that. And then also the most latest one is Stranger in Paradise Final Fantasy Origins, which I'm loving. It's melodramatic, it's silly, it's stupid in the plot. And the actual like combat is, again, another trend. It's like Dark Souls-y, Neo-y, because it's co-developed by Team Ninja. But it's easy, so like my bad at video games heart can actually like kind of experience a Souls-like fighting thing without dying all the time. I can just crank up casual mode and go wild.
Hey everybody, I'm Sabrina Scandura. I am the co-EIC here at FPS. You can find me on Twitter at Sabrina Alicia SG, or on the FPS Twitter because I often am on there. And I've been playing a ridiculous amount of Ori and the Will of the Wisps because I'm too much of a chicken to try Elden Ring despite my partner's constant requests. But yeah, like I've been obsessed with the game. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I went away for the weekend to go visit my parents, and the entire weekend all I did was sit there and sat there thinking, like, when am I going to be able to go back home so I can play more Ori? So yeah, the game is addicting, whether it is short or not. It is a time, let me tell you.
All right, my name is Giuseppe Femia. I am the first person podcast producer / host sometimes, and you can find me at _foolsbait on Twitter. I've been playing Pokemon Arceus, and I have mixed feelings about it, but what I've found it to be is a Pokemon scavenger hunt, and that is not all bad. All right, so if we just want to jump into it, Alex, would you mind starting us off?
No problem. I kind of want to talk about everyone's games for a while, but maybe we can get to that later. So I just wanted to sort of pick up from last time for those that have or have not listened. I think what we did, and maybe we can talk about if you disagree with sort of the way of phrasing it, but we discussed the sort of what of video game preservation. So what's happening, how communities are doing things, how the companies that sort of represent the lion's share of the industry, like Nintendo, are doing things. And what I wanted to get into this time, if we sort of could, is how or why that matters. So what does it matter that I'm paying attention to communities that are creating sort of hardware and software to help make games more preservable and accessible? And that's sort of the general framing I was thinking of, but I'm open to any sort of the other things we put in the listing here. So yeah, I don't know what the best way to start was. I can jump in anywhere, actually.
Okay, then along those lines, then what work are you currently doing with video game preservation?
So the work I do in preserving myself, so there's a lot of experimentation I do with community guides and things like this. So if I'm looking at setting up RetroArch, then the way I'll do it, RetroArch is the front end for emulation on computers and other platforms. The way I'll do it is I'll look at a YouTube guide and I'll follow it sort of to the T, and I'll see what the community says and see how they sort of voted with their mind share to figure out what the best way to do something like this is. I mod as many consoles as I can myself because I like to preserve my own collection. And I've gone back and actually bought sort of a second console to do this, so I'm not like ruining the one I have. It's gotten so much easier in the last few years too with the community doing stuff. The Wii U, we talked about it last time. The Wii U and 3DS shops are closing, and there's a time. There's a map for that Nintendo's laid out, and having the ability to sort of take those games and preserve them longer, I think that's really important. So that's one thing I've been working on most recently. Besides that, I'm sort of cataloging all of these other sort of interventions that community has made, not against, but against in some ways opposed to the way that Nintendo say would preserve. So some would call it piracy, and we can talk about that and how it works, but I don't think it is. After a certain point, maybe, like if you can't purchase this in the Wii U shop, channel's gone and your hard drive breaks, then are you at fault for then pirating the games that you rightfully own because you have the license? Those are the kinds of questions that I sort of deal with in my writing, and considering sort of the symbiosis, weirdly, that piracy has and emulation have with the sort of industrial design of somebody like Nintendo and all the sort of effects they've had on things like console generations. I'm leading into other sort of topics, but that's my start if anyone wants to weigh in. Yeah.
I'm immediately reminded of EA and Origin with The Sims. So way back, I used to have all of the Sims 2 games, like every expansion. And yeah, okay, I may have come across a few of them by borrowing the discs from my friends instead of purchasing them myself. But I remember when my hard drive got wiped and I couldn't find the discs anymore, I had to contact them. And back then, because it was fairly recently after Sims 3 came out, they were still able to like restore those purchases and give me digital copies. Now I can't get those anymore, and Origin is in the process of basically shutting down that kind of support. And there's going to be a point where I'm not going to be able to get any of those games back. Luckily, I recently have dug up the discs and found them, but it's really kind of annoying because if I think about games like Sims 3, for instance, I've only ever bought a digital copy of that and the digital expansion packs. I never had a physical CD. So if it gets to a point where they're no longer going to be supporting that restoration, which it definitely will get to that point at some point sooner, probably rather than later. I did buy that license. So it's kind of why, like, I have a problem with digital only copies because there doesn't seem to be longevity in that. I don't know if I'm making any sense when I'm saying that. Like, there's just, even though, like, okay, realistically, my computer doesn't necessarily support a CD drive unless I buy the separate piece for me to plug that in. And eventually, yeah, that technology is going to be obsolete. But at least I still have a physical copy and I have a way of going back. But when it's a digital only, like, it's so much harder to get that unless you pirate. And then there's that whole ethical question behind it, which is why, like, it's really interesting that you're getting into that, Alex.
Definitely. It's one of these questions of longevity for sure. And for some, it's a hypothetical question, right? Because you can't imagine somebody like Microsoft or Sony failing, or Nintendo, but Nintendo deliberately limits the life cycle of these things. One of the ways this connects in cultural studies, and I kind of end up in my research getting to the broader strokes of, what are the big influences that the history of design, somebody like Nintendo has done, have on us now, is planned obsolescence is a huge one. Planned obsolescence means in the same way that an iPhone only has a generation or two before they start to limit the battery life so that the processor is powerful enough to sort of run the software. I don't know if you all heard about that story from about a year ago. I think it broke. But basically, people were finding, and they'd known this for years, or they'd imagined for years that their iPhone was slower when there was an update, and they wondered why. And as it turns out, Apple was giving either you sacrifice battery life, and they didn't want to do that, so they were basically underclocking processors to make it work, so that it's still kept the battery life of the phone. That kind of thing. I think Apple in particular, but a bunch of other companies, Google and Amazon, big ones included, owe so much to Nintendo for what they've done, sort of breaking ground in the way that they've made something self-contained. And I love Nintendo for the sort of ingenuity and the inventive sort of software they've created. But they're kind of there's histories out there, right, about the very draconian way that they basically were authoritative about who could publish on their platform, who could release a game on the Super Nintendo. There were like literal limits, and there's all kinds of things we can get into. But yeah, it's a big precursor, I'd say, to what we're having and now, just with the physical space now being digital storefronts. Yeah.
So one person who really comes to mind when I think about this this conversation is the YouTuber. I think his YouTube channel is called Accursed Farms, and he runs this series called Ross's Game Dungeon. And one of the most prevalent themes on this on the series that's really focused on kind of showcasing like really kind of I wouldn't even say forgotten gems, just kind of completely forgotten relics of like DOS gaming or PC gaming and stuff like that from the past. Like the guy's been on record saying at best he's pretty much 10 years behind the rest of the crowd in terms of his gaming habits, right? So I love this series, and one of the most prominent themes that he's been showcasing within the last couple of years is these games who have online servers that are shutting down, and what happens to the legacy of a game after its online server shuts down and basically support ends for this game. There's some cases where you have a really active private community. They can get some private servers running up and online, and those dedicated player base. And yeah, I would highly encourage anyone listening to really go check out Accursed Farms. Check out what Ross is talking about on this subject. He has a lot of really good stuff to say that I think is relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, I know that there are like instances of people sort of like creating their own servers to host old online games, but then at the same thing, I guess a few years ago there was the thing where Blizzard shut down the like fan-made legacy WoW servers that like they're playing it in their original form. There seems to be this question among game preservationists or people who want to play games is like, corporations are so, especially Nintendo, are so against piracy or like any kind of like reproduction of like a product that they're not supporting anymore, but like they're not giving people good alternatives, to play these games. Like Nintendo, like would want to shut down emulation, but they're offering, like a very small selection of games you can play on their system. Like it's like if you're not supporting it, why are you not letting other people have access to this through other means? Like you're not making any money on it.
And on that point, how many of us, including myself, who I consider myself to be someone who kind of bleeds retro in terms of where my heart's at for gaming, how many of us wouldn't be able to say that about ourselves without a little bit of piracy here and there, a little bit of emulation on our old crappy Pentium 4 when we were a kid? I think there's a lot of us that are in that camp listening to this podcast and having this conversation. So I don't really agree with the policy that a lot of corporations like Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft put forward in terms of these old and orphaned works.
Just us being so like sheepish around piracy and like, do we pirate? It's like, of course we do. Like everybody who wants to like play video games like are pirating, and like we shouldn't call it piracy because it's not piracy. It's like just accessing works through non-capitalist means. Is there another word?
Yeah, I prefer to call it Robin Hooding, to be honest.
Yeah, one of the things I'd always recommend to somebody is like to think of piracy as this way of demoing something that you might want later. I don't know. I've always thought of it this way, especially for students when I'm talking to my undergrad students. Like if I won't give them a copyrighted work themselves, but if they know a place to find it and they can use it, then I don't care. I mean, I'm never going to see the inside of their hard drive, sort of thing. Especially with media where sort of access is so limited as well. Like I always encourage you to support artists where you can, and authors or game designers. But if it meant nobody played games, then that would be terrible. So it obviously has got to be happening, and it happens all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to argue necessarily for like the inherent good of humanity, but there's a lot of cases, and I can't cite any right now, where like people have accessed games for free, or no extra pay, and have still resulted in buying those games. Like I do that too. Like I will access games through non-capitalist means in order to try them out, and then I'm like, oh, I'm really loving this. Like I'm really loving Hades. I'm gonna go buy Hades because or like I can try a game like Elden Ring and be like, okay, cool. I'm so glad I experienced this. This isn't for me. I don't have to spend any of my time on it or any of my money on it, which I guess is time, as well. But yeah,
I feel
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, if you want an example, I think of back in the day when they used to include demos in cereal boxes. And then you go and, like, why is that? Why are there no digital I mean, there are digital versions of demos, obviously, but, like, I'm thinking of games made by AAA studios or whatever. Why don't they do demos anymore? They really should be doing demos still because I mean, I can't imagine the kind of sales that they would get, but also I'm not a marketing genius, so maybe there is a whole side of it that I don't understand. But in my mind, like that should realistically just still be the standard, even though it's not anymore.
Yeah. There's Colin's making a point in the chat that Doom runs on everything, and I think it's a great example of shareware being this thing that promotes the work more than sort of detracts from it. There's got to be some economist. I haven't managed to find them in my research yet, but somebody who's doing this kind of threshold work where they're like, okay, what if this game is released only on GOG and it's DRM free? And what that means, translated, means that anybody can take the executable file and then run it. So they can play the game for free. You can give it to your friends. So that version of the game, does it sell better or worse than all the others? And why? And so who's looking at that, right? Or people are, there's lots of numbers for Steam because of its popularity, but I wonder if there's any comparisons going on there and try to find it.
There was a case you might be able to look into. I know Lonely Mountain Downhill is available on Game Pass. And since they've put their game on Game Pass, which kind of essentially people aren't getting it for free, but they're paying a subscription to have like open access to it, they saw their sales climb. Even though they're offering it for like people imagine it as free, like I pay $11 and I get it for free. But, I feel like that still happens, or that happens.
Yeah, the sampling I think is an interesting idea, right? Because it's a full length demo if you wanted to think of it that way. Instead of every sort of publisher for every game offering a demo, Game Pass lets you for that selection of games just try them, see what you want. I've done it hundreds of times at this point, right? Just download something and check it out, and sometimes it's great, and sometimes it isn't, and sometimes it'll go off Game Pass, and I'll buy it because I miss the experience or whatever. But at least in this case, the publisher, I think, gets, again, each deal on Game Pass isn't published. Like some publishers developers talk about their deal with Microsoft, but it's not like a set thing. So it's hard to know if Game Pass is super profitable, depending on the situation. But it seems like it's enough that people are going to it. Sort of day one Game Pass releases. There's a question then, the media scholar in me is sort of like, there's a question of the Netflix effect at that point, though. So like, are only certain kinds of games going to be published on these platforms then? Like, is it going to be homogenizing? And there's always that sort of thing, right? There's a few series of shows I'd like to see more than 2 seasons of Netflix. If you just, could not cancel them right away, that'd be okay.
I mean, yeah, I think there is a huge risk of homogenization and like sort of the adapting products so that they fit better in that platform. I mean, like that's the same with like TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. It's like, even though it's like people creating it free, it's still adapting it to it.
We can talk about the academic side of things if you all are interested in that. So some of the things I've been saying, they come from a couple different places, primarily a media scholar. I work out of an English department, but there's an interesting thing that's happened in the past sort of 30 or 40 years where everything has become a text. So for people that are expecting us all to study Shakespeare in English, that's something that's changed a great deal. I'm sorry to say for some, but I'm sure most people know that. You can study film and video games and a bunch of other stuff. In my case, studying even the relationship between platforms of computing and the aesthetic work that comes out of them. So the software that's developed on these platforms. There's an MIT Press, what would you call it? Series. Let's just call it a series, I guess. Platform studies. There's a couple of scholars that are involved with creating that. and my work, in part, my research questions and my interest in community sort of comes out of the way those books have set out archives of material. So archives in the sense that they're trying to encapsulate a whole platform. This could be Flash animation as a platform. That's one of the books there. The Sega Genesis isn't one, but could be sort of idea. Super Nintendo is one. Nintendo Entertainment System is one. There's a few others. You can check it out. Maybe we'll link to it. But basically, those scholars, they do their own sort of historical work of figuring out what they want to basically construct. Like, how do you construct an image of this whole platform and how it works? Not just the software that was released on it, but the relationship of the platform to that software. And a couple scholars sort of started thinking about it, and they're like, well, community is sort of underrepresented here. Like, this is all official stuff. Like, this is mostly the stuff Nintendo released only, or only the Nintendo Power would be represented, or something like that. It's only official paratext or other elements. And so the thing is, these platforms have been, quote, dead. They've been maintained by communities for so long that they've been maintained longer than they were on the market. So it's like, who sort of has the louder voice, or sort of the ability to lay claim to Nintendo's legacy more than, or like a specific platform, so Super Nintendo's legacy more than Nintendo? And the answer is the people that have been, doing stuff with it since 1997 when they stopped doing stuff. And there's been so much work, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to highlight it. Work not just in terms of how do you use a Super Nintendo in 2022, which is its own hardware and display sort of puzzle, but also work in terms of how do you make a game, and can now anyone make a Super Nintendo game and put it on the platform? The answer is much closer to yes than you'd expect, especially since there's a sort of a homogenous culture that created those games in the first place in the US and Japan. It's like any sort of person who's interested now can look into these older platforms and really dive deep, become a designer, and do sort of amazing things. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from, I guess.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, there is a huge, well, from my own research, like a huge gap in the histories of like platform studies, or like histories of video games in total, on, what happens when these systems are out of sort of Western or, Japanese circulation. And yeah, ROM hacking or like emulation is totally like not thought of, or like, will be like a little mention in a book, or, like there's even like, Chinese made NES games from like the 90s to 2000s are like a big thing, but they're like very rarely talked about. I'm going to kind of mention one of our, I should find out who this is, but one of our articles on FPS is talking about a Final Fantasy VII remake on the NES, or rather a demake on the NES by there'll be a link in the show notes. I'll find it. But you should check that out, because that is like a big sort of it was made as like a whatever commercial product in China, but then picked up and translated by like a ROM hacking community, and has this whole history behind it. But like it's ignored in like the huge history of Final Fantasy VII, remakes.
It would be officially by Square forever, I think, if they had their way, right? Which is super interesting to me. I always wondered why that should be the case. When I was looking into this subject, I looked into the history of IBM. Because some of the first computer mainframes used emulation to keep this sort of parity with the platform before them. So I was thinking about how that works for them and how they represent it. And it's sort of like a footnote in most of the technical documents that this is a thing, right? The other aspect of it that you just made me think of was IBM's Model M keyboard is like the lasting sort of legacy of this whole thing, this whole history of computing. And IBM doesn't mention it in any of their official like 30-year anniversary literature. I did a bunch of research for a paper sort of looking into that. I know it's a parallel, but the same thing happens in video games. Nintendo isn't reaching out, and Square aren't reaching out to recognize these demakes and the community projects. If they are, it's like a tweet, which is awesome, like good for the creators. But those official histories are lacking in some ways because of that. I think they should have much more of a focus. And you could bifurcate it if you wanted to, and be like, this is the history while Nintendo and capitalism are in control of this thing, and here's the history after, the speedrunners and the modders and everyone else. But yeah.
Just to come back on what I was saying, the article is Remaking Legitimacy in Final Fantasy VII by Ian R. Larson. I don't want that name to go by without mentioning it. It's an amazing article.
I'm going to write that down now.
One thing I wanted to mention on this subject, if we're talking about kind of like, who the real ownership of the, the cultural identity, let's say, of these consoles are, or the legacy, I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with like how like the Sega Genesis and the Master System were made use of in the Brazilian market, but it's a whole kind of complicated thing that has to do with like Brazilian trade laws and import taxes and stuff like that. And the long and short of it is basically, if you were to kind of go down to Brazil and you think a PS5 is kind of unattainable and expensive here, it probably costs $3,000 US in Brazil. So a long time ago, a company called Tectoy, I believe it is, worked out a deal with Sega where they would basically manufacture Master System and Genesis hardware on Brazilian soil under the Tectoy brand in order to avoid these import laws and these taxes, and actually make gaming accessible to the Brazilian market and the Brazilian community. And what ended up occurring because of this is the legacy from the Sega Genesis in Brazil. It continues to this day in that community. There are still games being made and released for the Sega Genesis hardware, which is like almost as old as I am at this point, I think, to this day. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I've even had the privilege of playing some of these older ROM hacks and stuff like that. They're really fun. It's really incredible what they can come up with out there.
Yo, I gotta play some of those games. That sounds awesome. Just to have to say that.
Colin, load it up on your emulation system.
Oh, we can definitely do that. Unfortunately, that's still stuck at the old unit. We gotta make sure we lug that up to the new house soon.
Gotta have it for sure. Brazil is such a time capsule, an interesting time machine for that. I love it. It's like a speculative future where newer consoles didn't come out, and you just get to see what happens. Besides the ROM hack scene, there was a thing, I got to find the article. I'll try to find that for Joey later. But there's an article about Neogeo in Brazil, which is very similar. So what happened was they couldn't get Neogeo carts into the arcade machines fast enough, basically, for the demand for King of Fighters, a very particular fighting game series in Brazil. And so what happened was Brazilian developers and ROM hackers just took it and ran with it. They made their own versions. They updated old versions. And these were in arcade machines and pizza shops, like kind of situation. It wasn't, it was a very public relationship with emulation, which is really cool. And hacked development. It's very awesome. Yeah.
See, we talk about histories and everything like that, and my brain goes slightly different, just because based on my research, like where I want to come at this in my own studies, and where I kind of do cross into this territory but don't dive quite as deep as like say you do, Alex. So my whole why we need to preserve games as they were originally made on their original systems, whatever, and make that all accessible as much as possible is because I look at how specifically storytelling games develop and what kind of storytelling mechanics they use. And I feel like as much as emulators are a great way to get that experience, there is something to be said about how you don't quite get the same type of experience if you're not playing it on the original system. So for me, creating and cataloging that history and making it so that these original hardware and the original way of accessing these games is still accessible is extremely important, because otherwise then we miss an entire piece of how these games specifically were able to tell their stories and how they worked and how the player experienced that. Like I said, emulators definitely get us as close as we can if we can't get that format accessible anymore. But it's kind of sad that we don't have that format accessible. And Colin's just saying in the chat, this is why I own 50 game controllers. Yeah, there is something to be said about that. That helps for sure.
I think in game studies to begin with, there's a lot of issues with accessibility, because if you're reading a novel or watching a film, those two can be probably found online somewhere, but to be able to play any video game requires a level of actual competency in the game you play, but also the understanding of what kind of technology you need to use in order to actually go forward with that. So in terms of the community in general, there's an extra level of technological dependency that puts up another accessibility barrier with the studies in academia just as well as within the real life applications of it.
I agree with you. And controllers are one of these things where, so I'm in a video game reading group of sorts with a professor who's just now getting into gaming. You could say modernly for the first time. I think the last thing he played before we had this group was Doom. And I hope he doesn't mind me talking about it. I'm not going to say any names, but the controller has been such a huge obstacle for him, accessibility wise, like just understanding dual analog control, something that's sort of in our, we've made internalized over time, something that wasn't around, pre 2001 or 2, whenever I guess the Xbox did it or PS2 did it first. So yeah, there's a lot to do with those and preservation and just the way that's changed over time for sure.
Yeah, and it's something that really comes to mind kind of on this whole note of, and I know we talked a little bit of authenticity and everything during the last podcast, but again, on what Joey was speaking to too, is that's really where I would like to one day try to intervene and really make, I really think there's a place for like in the world of public history for video games in order to make these things a little bit more accessible. I really, really like looking at video games as cultural and anthropological artifacts that deserve to be preserved in the same way, all these fancy little glass objects and ceramic objects that they make me learn about at school do, right? So I hope that's something I can have a hand in one day, because it would be wonderful for me to see, like, and I don't mean just in a couple states in the US or something like that, but honest to goodness, like accessible video game museums or institutions where people can come in and play all these old games. And I know you see a little bit of that in these arcade bars that are popping up and stuff like that with the main cabinets, and you can sit down and play some Mario Kart or something like that at one of the tables. But to really see that kind of be picked up and embraced by the world of public history, I think would lead to overcoming a lot of these obstacles that we talk about in terms of like, needing to have a certain skill level or level of competency in order to access a lot of these old retro titles and be able to even, just emulate them on modern hardware, especially when we start talking about DOS.
Yeah, I'm immediately reminded of a podcast I actually recorded a little while ago, sorry, I can't talk apparently, where we were talking about just the entire area of game studies, but if I'm thinking specifically preservation, like for whatever reason, the powers that be failed to see the value in it, or not always failed to see the value, but there isn't as much value being put into this as there is like all of a sudden now we're seeing the value of preserving film and preserving movies. But it took a really long time to get to that. So I'm hoping that it doesn't take games that long, but like I do worry that it's not going to be seen valuable until it gets a little too late. That is a worry that I have. I don't know. Maybe I'm just catastrophizing again.
It's not so, I mean, it's pretty bleak at the moment, but it's not so hard for me to imagine thinking about Colin and Sabrina and Joy have said about sort of public, not interests, what am I thinking of? Like a public service to have games available to students, for example. So libraries rent games, but they have a limited sort of capacity to buy and sort of trade in, especially old physical games, which are, the market is sort of huge. But I think there's honestly a lot of legislative work that can be done to just sort of say to the major companies like, Nintendo, students should just have your games. Like they should be able to use them in the classroom at a station, and it'll promote their work. I never see it as a detriment to the market or to the saleability of anything. Maybe that's my optimism, but I have a feeling that it would probably just, encourage more. So the exposure to Nintendo in the classroom would mean kids would want to buy it at home or whatever. But I think there should be sort of relationships like that with the big companies that publish these games and have huge archives full of games, and they're incomplete, and they're they're not fantastic in some ways because they're not required to keep them that way. But if we had that public relationship, then they would be required to keep it that way. So anything going forward would be preserved almost at the source, and then sort of disseminated like a utility. You imagine art were a public utility sort of situation. Very, very optimistic, but I have hopes.
Yeah, I want to get I'm like, we should write a grant that gets single board computers like Raspberry Pis and puts RetroArch on them and distributes them to classrooms with controllers and everything like that. That would be beautiful.
Can we add to that grant also distributing the Nintendo Power magazines and collecting those? And
no, we should get now I'm just imagining. No, we should get people who are like also granted, who are gonna write about these games, like, hey, you should check out this game, and not go after like Nintendo's sort of corporate history, but their own sort of personal histories.
That would be
I
awesome.
love that.
Yeah. I would love to just see a class sort of over a year develop some games. I think that'd be an amazing thing at a elementary school level to introduce them to those sorts of things, especially with the tools which the community has sort of provided that would make it much easier than it used to be to make a game for a platform like Sega Genesis or Super Nintendo. Yeah, amazing.
And you know what, on that note that Alex was saying, if you're listening and you have the skill set to do that, please contact your local school board, volunteer your time, see if you can set something up, because you're going to make at least one of those kids fall in love with something that we all have a very deep passion for. And, you know, you're basically sowing the seeds for the future generations. So please, take some time out of your day, folks.
Could you imagine if we were allowed to, like, you know, if when we were kids, teachers didn't dismiss our love of video games as just some time-wasting thing? How much better we would all be.
I mean, with the risk of getting too into the weeds, it's very much because video games are not serious, and like that's the whole point. They are play, and that's kind of, I was thinking that, Sabrina, when you're talking about how like books and movies are like seen as preservable because they're now serious, but video games kind of, part of their essence, and there's so much more to them, obviously, is like play, and so they're by kind of their own existence not serious. So it's sort of like we need to just like reinvent sort of our views on play as worthy, you know.
Yeah, if you imagine it as frivolous or as recreation time only, and it's probably the way it sort of floats across maybe a teacher of a certain age's brain at the moment. I mean, in time that will hopefully change, because the people at the head of classrooms will be sort of more immersed in video game culture as time goes on. It doesn't have to change that way. I guess it might, though. I think almost the most popular game machine is a cell phone now. So that's almost antithetical to what we're talking about. But it would be the same. You still have play and games sort of preserved in the class. I hope that happens for sure. I got a couple other things here if you wanted to go through. So just more of the academic connections for people that are interested in that side of things. So there's a subset of media theory called media archaeology, which is all about digging into these kinds of histories and understanding sort of tech as artifacts, and in the McLuhan sense of understanding them as influential, something that sort of affects change and changes the way people think and use media, but also sort of changes the way they think in their everyday lives by using that media, by mediating through something. A cell phone, something that we see the world through all the time now, that we it's changed our physiology even, right? That we all have a little crick now, or there's a lot more people being treated for that issue of sort of having their head down that way, the neck strain. That kind of stuff comes up all the time. There's an author called Laurie Emerson, who writes a book called Reading Writing Machines, where she dives in part into sort of the history of iPads and sort of the speculative fiction of what if we had a ubiquitous tablet, and then what actually happened. So the iPad is a very different thing. It's a walled garden situation where Apple sort of controls all the aspects of it. The one that was imagined originally was very different. It was like you could go into any room and there'd be a bunch of tablets around, and you just use it as a tool and show it to everyone and write some stuff, and it's free to use for everyone. There was no ownership. So those kinds of things that have happened, those design paths that sort of fizzled out and ended up becoming something like the iPad. Media archaeology is about that in some ways. So the combination of platform studies and media archaeology is how I approach this kind of research. It's like, what is the speculative sort of future of everyone sort of having access to the things in the way we described? What does that look like? And what's prevented it in the past in terms of design, in terms of legislation, that sort of stuff. Yeah. I've got a few other books. I don't know how much we want to get into the weeds with that, but
I was going to say, I think you're scaring the capitalists out there with that ideology. But I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. Not that I'm like an anti-capitalist or anything like that. Well, okay. Personal opinions aside, what I mean is I think anything publicly funded has this very, or publicly accessible, has this very weird, like, reputation of just being bad for the economy when, like, you know, that's just not true. It just has to be implemented correctly and done in a way that does truly meet the needs of everybody. And I think the problem is like when sorry, I'm laughing at something Patrick said in the chat. Yeah, okay. This is a fair point for me to make without getting into trouble. It's not necessarily a bad thing for things to be accessible, is basically what I'm getting at. And I really think that there's a problem with trying to monetize everything so that we can keep the economy running, when it's like not everything needs to have that purpose. And I don't understand why that has to be the like running narrative that controls everything. I mean, on a larger level, I get it. That's because we are in a capitalist society. Fine, whatever. But why can't we change this? Like, why can't we just adjust things so that it's not just about, it's only a piece of entertainment so that we can make money so that helps the economy. It should also be seen as like, this is an artifact. This is a piece of art. This is a story. This is a whatever that we can make accessible in a library or in an institution. Like we have finally done that with older pieces of entertainment. Why can't we just, move it along? Maybe I have too high hopes for our society. Maybe I need to set my bar lower. I don't know.
Please never set your bar lower.
Well, you know what, Bree? That's why we're here having these conversations right now, right? Like, in terms of that battle, I firmly believe people like us are on the front lines of it. And if more people like us have conversations like this, and our peers and other areas of academic research start joining in on the conversation, then I think just like, other burgeoning fields like eco-criticism and stuff like that, I think when we talk about these things and we have these conversations, we do these podcasts and we get people involved, that's how we forge that path. And I'm just really privileged and thankful to be here with all of you fighting that battle.
Oh, that was the sweetest thing I've ever heard said on one of these podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe the moral of kind of our talk is just, if some kind of piece of media is meaningful to someone, it deserves preservation and it deserves to be accessible to anyone who wants to access it. And yeah, that is a very, as Sabrina was talking about, like a very anti-capitalist, borderline anarchist, that's the word, like way of seeing it. But it's very true. And I think that's, I guess, kind of what we're getting down to with video game preservation. It's like, these are meaningful, these are important. Let's let everybody have them.
I would definitely suggest that we don't need to have a top-down capitalist idea of any piece of art, that sold or not, where it's a company that makes it and sort of sells it, and that's it, and that's where it stays, and that's where it stays forever, and it goes to the second-hand market, and that's all. If that were the way it always works, and we know it doesn't, because we're all private pirates, I think, a little bit. Somebody is, everybody out there, a little bit, once or twice. And the reason that is, I think, is those constraints don't make a lot of sense over time. Like when you have something that's 30 years old, 20 years old, 10 years old, the developer isn't receiving the benefit anymore of that money necessarily. Digital storefronts could change that, to be fair. I'm giving them the ones that last forever, if those exist in the future, right? Then maybe you could still be supporting the developer directly. But it's very sort of difficult once that time has passed for me to argue that you shouldn't be able to see it. For fair use in journalism, for fair use in academia, for kids, for everybody who doesn't have that experience. We should, why the hell not? Right? I don't know.
You know what? I'm not going to be coy about it. I'm a pirate arg. I've done it more than a couple times, especially when I was a kid and I didn't have access to a lot of the brand new games that a lot of my friends did. I did have a PC that was just barely capable of running a lot of them, and the piratebay.org was probably in my favorite spot at that point in time in my life. And you know what? I firmly don't believe I would be the kind of person I am today if I didn't have access. So yeah, arg, I'm a pirate.
I think as a podcast, we should say, yes, we are all arg pirates.
That's maybe the title of this episode, Joe.
we need to change the theme song for this episode to just that one song on YouTube. You are a pirate. That should be the new theme song.
I mean, there was that sea shanty trend for a while. If we can find a good one to convey our views on video game piracy, I feel like it's a good idea. I basically have what's left in like 2 minutes, I'm presuming, is some show and tell if we want, and I can describe for the listener what I'm showing everyone on the podcast, or we can discuss more books and stuff, because there's a way that my research sort of starts in this technical sort of very in the weeds level of these are the things the communities are doing, and this is what it means to the person, the user, who's going to use the artifact or the hardware or whatever, the adapter to make their games work, their old games work. But it goes out to the level of design eventually, where it's like, how do we start from a place of this open accessibility, and who's already talking about that and in what spheres? We talked last time, I think, about iFixit. I could be wrong. It might have been mentioned. iFixit.com is basically like, so you've been given this closed thing, then it doesn't really upgrade good, and you want it to. So here's a guide, and here's some tools, and here's a specific kit that you can buy, and here's a video to follow, and here's all these resources. The community that I've been sort of researching, they do this all the time. There are guides on emulators and emulation in general, and how to set it up on any console you can think of. So if you have an interest in any of these things, there's a sort of way to find your path there. I think it's sort of amazing that it exists. Yeah. What do we want to talk about?
I think, leaving us with like a quick reading list would be nice for other resources listeners can go to.
Okay, so in the wider world of things, just go to iFixit.com and find a thing that you own and find out how easy it is to upgrade it or not. Because they give rateability and they give reviews, and they sort of give you an idea of how difficult it is on the scale of beginner and to expert in terms of opening your thing up. So think about that like in terms of your cell phone if you want, or any computer, especially computers that are getting slow around your house. Maybe you can reinvigorate them with more RAM or whatever. And that's not always easy, but iFixit might have your solution there. There's a book called A User's Guide to Privacy and Protest by Nissenbaum and Brunton. These are scholars that are interested in basically giving you a guide for how to be on the internet safely, in a sense where we're all surveilled and there's a lot of data happening, data mining, data being collected, and for what purpose we don't always know. So they run through in a pretty short book, but it's a great read, some techniques for what they call obfuscation. So it'd be like, how do you make yourself less visible to some of the ways that you're being sort of data mined? If you don't want that, if you're fine with it, by all means, keep using the internet the way you have been. But if you don't want Facebook to know certain things about you, or don't want to be, targeted ads, how does that work in this world, and what are they actually doing with that stuff? So that's a good book for that. I already mentioned Reading Writing Interfaces by Laurie Emerson. It's a little older now. I think it's 2014, but it's still great, and it digs into this kind of history that I'm interested in particularly the methodology, sort of diving into an artifact and looking at how it could work and what might have been, what could have been, how it went in the end anyway. And the other thing I already talked about platform studies, but Apperly and Perica write about the sort of limit of this kind of archiving that's been done in practice in platform studies. Platform studies is not like a prescriptive model. The scholars that do it, it's Nick Montfort and Ian Bogos, and they don't like tell you how you should do platform studies. Instead, they just give authors a platform to do it. So the thing that Apperly and Perica write is they write about this potential of community and this potential of us looking at the archive as more than the official one. I think it's a cool read. So yeah. Sorry if that's a little boring at the end, but yeah, reading lists, I love it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for joining us and for all that helpful information. If we just want to go down the line once again and introduce ourselves, we can bring this to a close.
So once again, I'm Colin Walsh. I'm an assistant editor in the commentary section. You can find me online at CW Glassworks on Instagram. Thanks for being here, folks.
I'm Alex. You can find me online streaming on Thursdays. The name of the stream is Super Combo Tech. I do old games and a bunch of other stuff with a friend who's at the Games Institute here with me, actually. So yeah, that could be fun if you want to check us out.
I'm Patrick. I am the co-AIC. If you want to talk about preservation or anything video games or games related, please contact us at FPS, firstpersonscholar.com.
I am Sabrina. I am the other co-EIC. You can find me on Twitter if you want to talk to me at Sabrina Alicia SG, or find us on Twitter at FPS Weekly. I also will be streaming soon, so please follow my Twitter to check when my new streaming schedule is. I've had to put that on hiatus as I was in the middle of a move, but I'm excited. And you can find that at twitch.tv/BrainiacBree.
And I'm Joey, and I run the podcast. Thanks for listening to the First Person Podcast. You can find us at FPS Weekly or start a conversation using the hashtag First Person Podcast on Twitter. First Person Podcast is produced by Giuseppe Femio with support from the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo.